Afghan tribal leaders say the recent killing of civilians by US troops was pre-planned amid rising anger and protests over the carnage. Over a dozen people are killed by US assassination drones in Pakistan's tribal regions. And US police arrest over a dozen Occupy protesters outside 5 branches of Chase Bank in Atlanta. Hello, it's 5:30 in the afternoon here in Tehran. You're with Press TV's World News. Anger is raging in Afghanistan following the massacre of 18 civilians by American soldiers in southern Kandahar province. Tribal leaders say the carnage was pre-planned.
Don America! Don America! Don America!
Anti-US demonstrations have been staged in Nangarhar province in condemnation of the killings. The protest rallies, which initiated at a university in Jalalabad, have now spread to other places. The protesters are calling for the immediate trial of the perpetrators. Meanwhile, Afghan lawmakers walked out of parliament on Tuesday in protest at the US carnage. Dozens of tribal leaders in Kandahar believed the tragedy was not just an accident, but it was pre-planned. Early on Sunday, several American soldiers went from house to house in 3 villages in Kandahar and shot dead 18 civilians, 9 of them children. Meanwhile, a high-level delegation appointed by the Afghan government to probe the US shooting rampage has come under attack in Kandahar province. The delegation was ambushed in Panjwai district, the scene of the killings. President Hamid Karzai has assigned the delegation to investigate the slaughter of civilians by American soldiers. 2 of Karzai's brothers, along with other high-ranking government, military and provincial officials, were reportedly in the delegation from Kabul. 1 Afghan soldier was killed and 2 people, including a civilian, were wounded in the ambush. Well, a candlelight vigil has been held in New York City in solidarity with the victims of the recent massacre in Afghanistan committed by US soldiers. Press TV's Susan Madaris reports from New York.
In the early hours of Sunday morning on March 11th, the world woke up to a tragic news event, a massacre, the killing of civilians, women and children included, as funeral processions were held for the victims of the Panjwai district in Afghanistan. A candlelight vigil was also held in New York to pay respect to the innocent lives lost, their families and communities.
I read what had happened, and I tried to imagine how the neighbors and family members of the children who were killed and women who were killed must feel. I just felt I had to go somewhere and do something to say that all Americans are not monsters.
According to a new Washington Post ABC News poll, overall views of the war in Afghanistan are at an all-time low. 60% of Americans see the war as not worth its costs.
How much of our budget goes straight to the military, and so we have to cut off jobs and healthcare and education and housing here, and all this money is being spent instead on wars abroad.
And while the Pentagon said in a media briefing that the killings were, quote, tragic, it insisted it was an isolated incident. Many believe that's simply not the case.
This is really not an isolated act. We have been just horrible in our bombings.
Participants at the vigil also stressed that the people of Gaza and Palestinian territories should also be remembered.
I'm also coming because I recognize that the poor people of Gaza have recently suffered a horrible loss and bombing. I just think all the wars are destroying our lives.
The event has been put together by Afghans for Peace and other New York City-based people of conscience.
Similar vigils are being held simultaneously across America, in other states like California and Washington, as well as countries abroad like the UK and Canada.
While the Taliban has vowed revenge in the aftermath of the shooting rampage, the White House announced the shootings would not affect the schedule for U.S. troop withdrawal. Susan Modaris, Press TV, New York.
At least 16 people have been killed in 2 U.S. drone attacks in Pakistan's northwestern tribal belt. The airstrikes took place in the South Waziristan region. There's been a surge in U.S. drone attacks against other nations since President Barack Obama took office in 2009. The U.S. uses the aircraft in several Muslim countries, including Yemen and Somalia. Pakistan has borne the brunt of the deadly air attacks. Washington claims the drones are aimed at taking out militants, but most of the victims have turned out to be civilians. The UN has condemned Washington's use of unmanned planes for what it calls targeted killings, which the world body says violate international law. U.S. police have arrested at least 14 Occupy protesters in the city of Atlanta. The demonstrators were protesting against corporate greed outside the branches of Chase Bank. The 99%ers say police gave the protesters no warning before making arrests. Police have charged a number of detainees with criminal trespassing. U.S. police have made thousands of arrests as part of a crackdown on the Occupy movement over the past 6 months. And also in the news today, Greek state employees have staged yet another protest against the government's austerity measures. Workers at the Development Ministry in Athens occupied the building in a symbolic action to show opposition to the shutting down of public organizations. Separately, staff at state mental health clinics and daycare centres rallied outside the health ministry. Their institutions are on the list to be closed down as part of spending cuts. The measures have been requested by international lenders in exchange for a new loan that Greece has received. The programme will see some 15,000 state workers laid off this year. The minimum wage and pensions are also to be reduced, while many state organisations will close down. Konstantin Venizelos is our correspondent, joining us now on the line from Athens to give us more on this. Konstantin, so first of all, tell us about the wave of strikes, the protests that are ongoing where you are.
Good evening, Homer. Well, the Greek economy has been in recession for 5 years in a row, and it continues to shrink at a frightening pace. Greek GDP was 7.5% smaller during the fourth quarter of 2011 than it was in 2010, and unemployment in Greece also continues to get worse. Of course, the average unemployment rate in Greece at the moment is 21%, with unemployment among the young people hitting the hardest at 51%. Of course, Greece has now defaulted officially, technically, and there will be more austerity measures legislated here after the upcoming national elections. We still have the abolition of thousands of organic posts from the state sectors. There will be, of course, further reduction, further tax hikes, and further reductions in wages and pensions. So, of course, the memorandum and the triumphant celebration of the Greek government for the PSI deal bears little resemblance and significance to Greek workers in the public and private sectors, who are reacting, of course, and will continue to do so up until the elections and perhaps afterwards as well.
So basically, Konstantin, is the Greek government, however, under enough pressure to force it to meet some of those demands that are being made? Do you think that there is enough public pressure, or rather public anger is at the extent that would influence the government decisions?
Well, the Greek government is cornered. It faces European pressure and it faces domestic pressure. To secure the next aid package, Greece needed to complete the swap, the PSI swap deal, and commit to making structural changes to its economy. Of course, the finance chiefs carry on meeting. They will meet again tomorrow. They met yesterday. Still, no cash has found its way to Greece, although European finance ministers have have released 35.5 billion euros to Greece, but that money, of course, is almost all of the second aid package to Greece has been promised to private investors and banks as sweeteners, and of course most of it will go to the recapitalization of Greek private banks. Therefore, no money will go towards developing a true financial growth plan for the country. This is what today's reaction was all about, and of course, you know, it is understood now that the PSI deal and the second memorandum does not really protect Greek workers from poverty, from austerity, and from the further plummeting of living standards in Greece.
Okay, thank you very much for now, Konstantin Venizelos, our correspondent, joining us there on the line from Athens with the latest. Let's move on with the news now. A senior Iranian official has strongly criticized a UN report which accuses the country of violating human rights. The head of Iran's High Council for Human Rights says the report by UN investigator Ahmad Shahid is biased.
In the report that is submitted to this council, it contains explicit, numerous, reiterated support for notorious terrorist groups which are responsible for tens of deaths of our people just in the recent years. And he does not mention a single word about our scientists who has been subject to the assassination, which is plotted by United States and applied by this terrorist group. So how our people should feel about the reporter, which does not enjoy the slightest sympathy with a nation which lost their young, beloved scientist and engineer.
The United Nations is holding its annual anti-drug meeting in Austria, and Iran's innovative strategies are attracting international attention. UN statistics show Iran is currently the world's leader in illegal narcotic seizures. Such success has led the UN to call Iran its #1 partner in the fight against drug trafficking. Press TV's Ramin Mazoheri reports from Vienna.
At the United Nations 55th Commission on Narcotic Drugs, speaker after speaker noted that the war on drugs has lasted for decades, but with little results. Iran's anti-narcotic efforts are very different from the usual thinking, and that could explain why they've been so successful.
Last year, Iran's anti-drug forces were responsible for 90% of the global seizures of opium and 40% of the world's heroin. The US and EU, which are the destination areas for these drugs, need to fulfill their responsibilities by contributing more equipment and resources to Afghanistan.
Many countries fill their jails with drug users, but Iran's addicts avoid prison and even fines if they complete drug rehabilitation. The UN has called Iran a regional leader for its widespread construction of treatment centers, use of methadone in recovery programs, and distribution of syringes among addicts to prevent AIDS.
In recent years, we have taken many actions in the fields of prevention and treatment. We use different methods for addicts, such as counseling or job training, to clear the way for their social integration.
The destruction caused by the U.S.-led invasion has made Afghanistan's opium crop even more important, with price and production levels increasing since war began in 2001. The U.S. and NATO spend far more money on bombings, police training, and building infrastructure than solving the key issue, getting Afghan farmers to grow other crops effectively. But there's no profit for the NATO coalition in improving crop yields.
We should immediately find alternatives for Afghan farmers to cultivate crops other than opium. International assistance must be extended to a poor nation like Afghanistan. But we don't see a firm will from other countries for getting results. Iran has already started our actions in this important area.
Poppy production in Afghanistan and Pakistan has led Iran to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on walls and fortifications and causes an average of 4 armed clashes a day. When you combine Iran's efforts to stop drug trafficking, its focus on the needs of the Afghan farmer, and its enlightened view of drug addiction as a chronic health disease and not as a weakness which deserves a prison sentence, it's clear that few countries are solving the drug problem as effectively as Iran. Ramin Mazaheri, Press TV, Vienna.
Israeli soldiers have opened fire at a group of Palestinian mourners in the Gaza Strip, wounding 2 teenagers. The incident happened at a funeral ceremony for 2 Palestinians killed in Israeli attacks. At least 25 Palestinians have lost their lives in airstrikes since Friday. Retaliatory rocket attacks by Palestinian fighters have left several Israelis wounded. Earlier, Egypt announced Tel Aviv and Palestinian resistance group have agreed to a truce. The Islamic Jihad movement has said it will respect the ceasefire only if Tel Aviv ends assassinations in Gaza. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said the attacks will continue. You're watching Press TV's World News. Another look now at the headlines. Afghan tribal leaders say the recent killing of civilians by US troops was pre-planned amid rising anger and protests over the carnage. Over a dozen people are killed by US assassination drones in Pakistan's tribal regions. And US police arrest over a dozen Occupy protesters outside 5 branches of Chase Bank in Atlanta. Still to come here on Press TV's World News, hate groups are rising in the United States. We'll be back.
How much do you know about the issues that affect you? Ever feel like you should have a chance to express your opinion? A Simple Question is the show where we hit the streets to find out what the public think. This is the show where you get your say.
Welcome back. Also in the news today, the UN Arab League Joint Envoy on Syria says he expects a response from Damascus on his proposals today.
I'm expecting to hear from the Syrian authorities today, since I left some concrete proposals for them to consider. And once I receive those, their answer, we will know how to react.
Annan's proposals are part of efforts to help resolve the crisis in Syria. He made the remarks after meeting with some Syrian opposition members in Turkey's capital, Ankara. He described the meeting as useful. Annan arrived in Ankara on Monday following a 2-day visit to Damascus, where he met with President Bashar al-Assad. The president said he supports any, quote, honest effort to resolve the crisis. But he said dialogue or political processes will fail as long as terrorist groups operate in Syria. Meanwhile, Assad has set parliamentary elections for May the 7th as part of the reforms promised by the government. More than 130 armed men have surrendered to the Syrian authorities in northwestern city of Idlib as violence continues to rage on in the restive region. The army has also dismantled 33 bombs that armed groups plan to detonate in the city. Earlier, 10 soldiers were killed when armed gangs attacked their checkpoint in Idlib. 12 security service members were also killed in an ambush by armed groups in the city of Dar'a. Syria has been gripped by almost a year of unrest, which the UN says has killed thousands. Damascus says over 2,000 of its armed forces are among those killed. A top Hezbollah official has said we're witnessing a time of political retreat. that we are rather witnessing a time of political retreat for countries which have been part of what he considers a conspiracy against Syria. He's also accused the US Embassy in Beirut of being a spy den for operations against Syria. Our correspondent has more.
Hezbollah has accused the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon of overseeing the infiltration, armament and operations against Syria.
The U.S. ambassador to Lebanon is trying to stir up sedition, and what's more dangerous is that U.S. officers are overseeing the infiltrations, armament and operations against Syria.
Deputy head of Hezbollah's Executive Council, Sheikh Nabil Qawuq, also lashed out at the March 14th coalition, saying that they are arming, financing and overseeing the attacks against Syria through the Lebanese-Syrian border. The March 14th denies such claims, saying its activities in northern Lebanon is for humanitarian purposes, to help the Syrian people who have taken refuge there.
We refuse such accusation. We have been helping the Syrian people for humanitarian purpose, no matter what they were doing inside Syria.
Sheikh Nabil Qawuq said pro-US Arabs backed out of their slogans and plots against Syria and agreed with Russia on a new initiative. Hezbollah has described the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon as a military operation room against Syria. Now, analysts believe that the U.S. Embassy does have a history of intelligence work aimed at Beirut and Damascus. And despite the U.S.'s latest claim to have refused to arm the Syrian opposition, it has been financing the Syrian opposition even before the unrest began in Syria 1 year ago. Former Lebanese Minister Michel Samaha told Press TV that the visits of Michael Vickers, U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, to Beirut shows that the U.S. Embassy is in a war of espionage with Syria.
The multiple visits of Mr. Michael Vickers to Lebanon was preparing to make this operation sure enough in Akkar, Tripoli, Bekaa, and through that to Syria. And I consider that these operations involve technical assistance, intelligence assistance, arms assistance, and operational assistance.
Since the unrest began percolating in Syria in mid-March last year, several reports have suggested that arms were being smuggled from Lebanon into Syria to support the opposition. Some Arab countries, such as Qatar, have called on the United Nations to send arms to the opposition groups. However, the United Nations seems to be brokering a political solution which could be backed by Russia, a main critic of U.S. policies in the Middle East. Mariam Saleh, Press TV, Beirut.
Russia's confrontation with Western powers over the Syrian situation has reached a new peak. Moscow, along with Beijing, have firmly rejected calls by the United States, France and Britain to empower armed gangs to topple Syria's President Assad. In an interview with Press TV, senior Russian political analyst Alexander Prokhanov said that the Kremlin will not allow a repetition of the Libya-style Western war on Syria.
В смысле политическом и в моральном смысле Россия поддерживает.
Russia supports Assad and is still very negative about military intervention in Syria by a group of terrorists, the Turkish army and Turkish special services. I think that through closed channels, Russia makes it clear to Americans and the West that Libyan version will not happen again, and that Russia will support Bashar Assad, and that the attempts of bombing Syria will end for the Americans very tragically, because during this time Syria acquired anti-aircraft missile complexes produced in Russia.
Prokhanov also said Russia will continue to support Iran in its nuclear standoff with the West.
Putin understands that the security of Iran and a strong Iran are helpful for Russian foreign policy. The weakening of Iran, I'm not even talking about the bombing, the weakening of Iran could weaken its role in the Middle East. It means the strengthening of the Europeans and the US. Certainly, Putin is an obvious ally of Iran. Any resolution of the UN Security Council on Iran which exceeds that which has already been accepted will be rejected by Russia.
Elsewhere in the news now, according to recent reports, hate groups are on the rise in the United States. It's part of a trend since Barack Obama became the country's president. Press TV's Colin Campbell reports from Washington.
Hate is spreading in America. That's according to what reports indicate. Lemmy is a college student who emigrated from Ethiopia. He says he doesn't feel that he's ever been a target of hate, but what he's read doesn't encourage confidence.
It impacts me because then I start to feel, when I start to see things like that, how am I being looked at? So it kind of makes me question my steps.
Hate groups often target people based on skin color, religion, sexual preference, or other differences against the mainstream of the public. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, in 2000, there were just over 600 described hate groups. Now there are more than an estimated 1,000.
So it's almost a fear or a threat to their everyday lives, where I have to work twice as hard now to compete with someone who's out of the country.
The SPLC says the increase is happening because of racial tension, conspiracy theories, and frustration over a struggling U.S. economic recovery. Unemployment is a big issue. Mark Potok spoke to us from the SPLC headquarters in Montgomery, Alabama.
The economic anger over the economy, over the bailouts, which many people saw as being aimed at the wealthy executives and mortgage brokers, not the working man. Those kind of things, that really plays in quite a lot into the growth of this movement as well.
Experts say hate groups are often reactionary, mostly to salient topics that are being discussed here in the U.S. Recent reports show there are two main hate groups that have seen a spike in the past 2 years. One of them, anti-Muslim hate groups. Lemmy says hate groups' behavior has the potential to be damaging to the development of the country as a whole.
It affects everyone, your community that you live in, because then now people have a negative judgment of you.
Hate groups have also risen since President Obama took office in 2008.
Racial changes happening in this country that are real and that distress some people. The Census Bureau has predicted that non-Hispanic whites will lose their majority in the United States by the year 2050.
Experts say they expect hate groups to grow if President Obama is reelected.
It's just exponential. It's 755% growth in 3 years, but also to the person of Barack Obama, our first black president, and what he represents in terms of the changing racial demographics of our population overall.
Some say anger from hate groups could get worse before it gets better. Colin Campbell, Press TV, Washington.
Well, that brings us to an end of this edition of the news. Do stay with us at the top of the hour. It's News in Brief.